The last stagecoach robbery in American history didn't happen in some sun-scorched canyon, with 6 shooters blazing and bandits on horseback thundering into the sunset. It happened on a frozen December night in 1916, on a lonely mountain road in Nevada, when a mailman named Fred Searcy drove his 2-horse wagon straight into an ambush that would make legal history. By morning, Searcy would be dead. $4,000 would vanish into the wilderness, and the killer would become the first person in America ever convicted by a palm print. The Old West was dying, but it wasn't going quietly. Jarbidge, Nevada sits tucked into a remote canyon near the Idaho border, the kind of place that barely qualified as a town even by frontier standards. In December 1916, maybe 200 souls called it home, most of them miners working claims in the surrounding mountains. The town had sprung up just 6 years earlier during a small gold rush, built fast and rough the way mining camps always were. Wooden buildings lined a single muddy street. Saloons outnumbered churches. And every day except Sunday, the mail wagon made the treacherous run from the railroad station in Rogerson, Idaho, bringing letters, packages, and occasionally something more valuable. Fred Searcy knew that route like he knew his own face in the mirror. He'd been driving mail wagons for years, handling the rains through blizzards and summer heat, navigating switchbacks that dropped off into nothing. December 5th started like any other run. He loaded his wagon at Rogerson, hitched his team, and headed out into the gathering darkness. The temperature was dropping fast. Snow threatened. Searcy wrapped himself in his heavy coat and kept the horses moving at a steady pace. Somewhere in his cargo sat $4,000 in currency, payment for miners' wages and local business transactions. It might as well have been a fortune. The road wound through rugged country, following the canyon walls where pine trees pressed close and shadows gathered thick even in daylight. About 3 miles outside Jarbidge, the trail narrowed where a culvert passed beneath it. This spot had a name locals used, the Narrows. Perfect place for an ambush if anyone was fool enough to try robbing a mail wagon in the 20th century. Someone was exactly that foolish, or that desperate, or that coldly calculating. The blow came without warning. Something heavy smashed into Searcy's skull with enough force to knock him clean off the wagon seat. His body tumbled into the snow beside the trail. The horses spooked, but didn't bolt, trained well enough to stand even with their driver gone. Blood pooled dark against the white ground. Searcy never had a chance to reach for a weapon, never saw his attacker's face, never knew what hit him. He died there in the freezing darkness while his killer tore through the mail pouches looking for cash. The horses stood waiting through the night, their breath steaming in the cold air, the empty driver's seat a testament to violence done. When dawn came and the wagon still hadn't arrived in Jarbidge, people started asking questions. Search parties formed. Men grabbed lanterns and rifles and headed back up the trail, calling Searcy's name into the winter morning. They found him at the Narrows, frozen stiff, his skull caved in. The mail pouches had been ransacked. $4,000 in currency was gone, and the Old West had just recorded its final stagecoach holdup. The murder sent shockwaves through Jarbidge despite the town's rough character. Robbing the mail was federal business, which meant serious consequences. Killing the mailman made it worse. The investigation came fast and thorough. Postal inspectors arrived from Elko. The sheriff started questioning everyone in town. And at the crime scene, they found something the killer never anticipated would matter. A bloody palm print on the wagon's dashboard, clear as day, pressed there when the murderer steadied himself while rifling through the mail. Suspicion fell quickly on a drifter named Ben Cool. He'd blown into Jarbidge a few weeks earlier, working odd jobs, drinking too much, talking too loudly about needing money. People remembered seeing him around town the day before the robbery. When investigators searched his cabin, they found fresh bloodstains on his overalls that he couldn't explain away. But it was that palm print that sealed his fate. Investigators carefully documented it, photographed it, preserved it as evidence. Then they took Ben Cool's palm prints and waited to see if modern science could do what eyewitnesses and circumstantial evidence alone might not accomplish. The trial began in September 1917, 9 months after Searcy's murder. Elko County packed the courtroom. Everyone wanted to see if palm print evidence would actually hold up in court. No American jury had ever convicted anyone based on palm prints before. Fingerprints, sure, those had been used since the early 1900s. But palm prints? That was untested legal territory. The prosecution brought in experts who testified that the bloody print from the wagon matched Ben Cool's palm with absolute certainty. They pointed out ridge patterns, swirl formations, unique characteristics that appeared in both samples. The defense argued it was junk science, untested theory, not reliable enough to send a man to the gallows. The jury didn't buy the defense's argument. After deliberating, they came back with a guilty verdict. Ben Cool became the first person in American history convicted of murder based on palm print evidence. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. He'd killed Fred Searcy for $4,000 that he never got to spend. Money that disappeared into the Nevada wilderness and stayed disappeared. Treasure hunters still search Jarbidge Canyon, looking for that stolen currency, convinced it's buried somewhere in those mountains, waiting. But here's what makes this case more than just another murder, more than just a legal milestone. The Jarbidge mail robbery marked the absolute end of an era. No more stagecoach holdups would ever happen in America. The frontier was closed, the wild days were over, and even in remote mining camps like Jarbidge, modern law enforcement and forensic science had arrived to stay. Ben Cool thought he was pulling off a simple robbery in the old tradition, the kind of crime that had happened 10,000 times across the West. Instead, he walked straight into the future, where science could identify criminals from traces they didn't even know they'd left behind. Fred Searcy died doing an ordinary job on an ordinary night, killed by a man who wanted easy money and didn't care who got hurt. $4,000 bought Ben Cool a life sentence and a place in legal history. The horses stood faithful in the snow while their driver's blood froze. And somewhere in Jarbidge Canyon, if the stories are true, that money still waits in the ground, the last unclaimed treasure of the Old West.